Welcome. Good afternoon, good morning. Just waiting a couple of minutes until the attendees enter in the room. Good afternoon again, good morning. Welcome to the webinar, Sanctions on Organized Crime, a strategic framework for impact assessment. This discussion is part of a webinar series on sanctions and organized crime. In 2021, the Global Initiative launched a focused research initiative on the use of sanctions to counter organized crime. This draws together a number of our organized crime observatories and thematic programs. This webinar is part of the fourth in the series that presents some of the preliminary findings. In the first event, we outlined how use of sanctions against criminal actors has grown from an approach limited to the US, predominantly leveraged to respond to Colombian drug trafficking threats, to a far larger number of jurisdictions employing them, and expansion of types of criminal actors targeted by sanctions regime. In the last two events, we've done deep dives into specific case studies. The first one looked at the impact of the Kimberley process on the diamond and gold sectors in CAR. And the second webinar, we looked at the impact of recent sanctions on the gang crisis in Haiti. All of these webinars were recorded, so if you missed the discussions, please feel free to go to the Global Initiative's website and explore some of the previous sessions. In today's sessions, we will be focusing on framing how we can analyze and understand impact in the context of sanctions leveraged to respond to TOC. This session is designed in a discussion format, so please join this conversation by dropping your question in the Q&A function on the bottom of the Zoom page, and I will cluster them together and try to address to the panelists. So before we start, I would like to turn to my colleagues, Lucia Bird and Matt Herbert, our speakers today, for them to introduce themselves.
Good morning, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us here today. My name is Lucia Bird, and I'm Director of the Global Initiative's West Africa Observatory, as well as co-lead of our sanctions workstream and co-author of the report that we're launching here today.
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dr. Matt Herbert. I'm the head of research for North Africa and the Sahel at the Global Initiative, as well as co-leading alongside Lucia, the focused research initiative that we're doing on sanctions against transnational organized crime. I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you both. So I would like to start with a question to you, Lucia, first. So to start with, why is now a good time to think about the purpose and impact of sanctions?
Well, as you noted, and as we've explored in some of the other episodes in this series, there has been a dramatic expansion in the use of sanctions as a tool of statecraft over the last 2 decades. And we've seen growing numbers of states levying designations on a growing range of different actors. But crucially, there's been a material shift in the type of actors targeted. So we've seen an overall movement away from sanctioning states with very broad-based sanctions and towards targeted sanctions on individuals and organizations. And in parallel, we've seen a sharp rise in thematic regimes focusing on issues such as terrorism, organized crime, corruption, or human rights violations, in which it's the designee's conduct rather than that of states, which is the main motivational concern for the designating jurisdictions.
Yeah, so I mean, I broadly agree with Lucia. I think I'd also note that while we've seen a substantial evolution in the number of regimes that are being used to target transnational organized crime, a sharp increase in the number of designations that are being leveled on actors that have been deemed criminal or corrupt by various jurisdictions that are levying these sanctions. I don't think that the analytic frameworks and the strategic aims and the intent of the sanctions have really advanced. What our research has really underscored is that the theory and strategy around sanctions use remains really heavily influenced by the sort of nation-state focused sanctions regimes, which have historically formed the really dominant strain of sanctions approaches. Now, this is a problem. There are very real differences, including in opportunities as well as realistic goals, between sanctions on states and sanctions on criminal actors. And this really has implications on how we assess impact, frame public expectations, and develop strategy within governments and between governments. So it's crucial to really nail down the differences here and start to look at the issue of sanctions on organized crime as quite separate conceptually and quite separate in intent and potential impact from what we've seen come before.
That's very interesting. But how do the goals of regimes that we are seeing increasingly targeting transnational organized crime actors differ from previous regimes more focused on other concerns such as terrorism?
Sure, that's a really good question. First, what I'd say is that country-focused regimes and terrorism regimes, and this has really formed the dominant strain of sanctioning approaches, country regimes, since the 1920s, but certainly since 1945. Terrorism regimes are a little bit newer, but certainly post 9/11, they came to the fore globally. You find most countries in the world now maintaining some type of terrorism sanctioning approach, either through the UN or through autonomous regimes. What we see with both country regimes and terrorism regimes, though, is that conceptually, the goal of that regime is to impact issues which are largely rooted either in ideology, in politics, or in policy. Organized crime-focused regimes, in contrast, really target conduct that's motivated primarily by financial interest. So they're quite different there. I think second, in country regimes, you're generally aiming to change a specific policy or scenario. So to use a historic example, sanctions placed on South Africa were meant to end apartheid there. By contrast, if you look at criminal and corruption thematic regimes, these are typically very open-ended, less clear on distinct and realistically attainable goals that they seek. Put simply, the destruction of a given terrorist group, so Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State, while difficult and lengthy, is a clear and identifiable target. In contrast, combating major organized crime groups, corruption, human rights violations, or even more so, entire illicit markets such as drug trafficking, via sanctions and other tools of national influence is far more opaque. What feasibly can be done? What impact can you hope for? And this is what we really have tried to dig into with this research.
If I can pick up on a point that you said, and often publication of sanctions regimes is accompanied by statements by the issuing authority. Doesn't that help identify the purpose of a sanctions regime or designation?
Yeah, I think it's definitely helpful data to consider, but it doesn't get you all the way there. That's the important point. Oftentimes there's a substantial disconnect that's emerged between extremely ambitious rhetoric by policymakers about what sanctions are looking to achieve and the real attainable goals that the regimes and the designations were built on. So for example, if you look at the United States, one US politician in statements accompanying a set of criminal designations in 2008 referred to efforts to, quote, end the suffering of trade in illicit drugs that are inflicted on Americans and other people around the world, as well as preventing drug traffickers from supporting terrorists. These are very big goals, and they're likely in many ways unattainable. They're not very specific. So strategy and policy documents that you look at that are issued are oftentimes full of these. Now, when you actually talk to individuals that are involved in the development of a policy around sanctions, so those that are the professionals working within governments, they're oftentimes much more realistic about their intents and aims. But usually this doesn't really get transmitted out to the public. And what this means is the disconnect leads the public to often understand the purpose. The purpose of these sanctions is seeking to end or at least drastically decrease illicit markets. And this in turn shapes how stakeholders have assessed the impact of the regimes. of individual designations and sanctions regimes overall. So, for example, if the drug trade in Mexico has not been ended, or if human trafficking and smuggling through Libya has not been ended, the tendency is to say that the use of sanctions has failed at some sort of overall level or not had any sort of impact. But I think that really we need to have a more granular, realistic understanding of purpose. So to contribute to this, the Global Initiative has developed a new framework for thinking about and assessing sanctions regimes on transnational organized crime, to really start getting into that very nuanced approach on what's feasible, what's practical, what can be assessed, and ultimately what should the strategic goals hinge upon in some of these open-ended thematic regimes.
Thanks, Matt. I think it would be interesting to have a look at this conceptual framework. So perhaps, Lucia, if you could explore a little bit how the framework would look like for analyzing the impact of sanctions responding to organized crime.
Sure. Well, first off, it operates on two distinct levels. At the overarching level, we consider strategic goals, which relate to the overall purpose of the relevant sanctions regime, whether it's thematic or country-focused. And here, strategic objectives also apply to contexts where there has been a series of designations under a thematic regime, which are linked either through the connection to a group or an individual within a given country or within a given region. And then we move to the different, more granular level, and we turn to considering designation objectives that speak to the desired impact from individual listings. Traditional frameworks have tended to overlap the intent of individual designations with the broader strategic aims of a given regime. So imposing targeted sanctions on an official in a state engaged in proliferation, for example, is intended to shift or hamper individual behavior in order to ultimately build pressure on the state to change the behavior. But when thinking about this in the context of organized crime, we think that for criminal-focused regimes, the objectives of individual designations and the strategic aims of regimes or groups of linked designations are distinct. Of course, they're not and should not be entirely separate, and designation objectives should feed into the accomplishment of the strategic goals. But assessing purpose and then impact at these two distinct but interrelated levels provides greater structural clarity. And I think it's important to emphasize, as Matt trailed upon, that we built this framework through many extensive engagements with policymakers to understand what the goals really were at a technical level, and then sought to structure these in a way that allowed for clearer analysis. And at this stage, I think it's helpful to visualize the framework. So on the screen, you can see that first, within the strategic goals, we identify three broad typologies: disrupting criminal networks, reshaping harms linked to illicit economies, and revealing otherwise hidden information on the function of criminal markets or activities of corrupt individuals. So taking each of these in turn, starting with disruption. Here we're talking about seeking to diminish the ability of an illicit network, including non-designated actors, to operate in ways that drive defined harms of particular concern to the sanctioning jurisdiction. And it's key to bear in mind that the impact on effectiveness or efficiency extends beyond those directly designated. Although it may sound similar, this is crucially distinct from eliminating or dismantling criminal networks and is much more of a nuanced, realistic set of goals. The second strategic goal of sanctioned regimes on transnational organized crime and corrupt actors involves the shaping of the situation. By this, we mean altering the function of a criminal ecosystem, generally by influencing the cost-benefit assessments made by designated, but also particularly non-designated actors, in order to deter or minimize certain harms or to promote adherence to norms of behavior. And sanctions are, of course, very selective. And the selection of targets is often due to very specific harms that are linked to a certain group, such as involvement with specific types of narcotics, acute or particularly high-profile violence, or money laundering activities that pose a broader threat to the financial system. And Often these harms, although of course they pose an advantage to organized criminal groups, are not necessarily integral to the functioning of the criminal ecosystem. So, for example, in Libya, the systematic physical abuse of migrants by human smugglers was, and in many cases continues to be, a choice taken by smugglers, but it's not inherently linked to the smuggling process per se. So by sanctioning criminal actors involved in particular harms, international actors can influence the cost-benefit analysis for actors engaging in an illicit economy. This may not result in the complete ceasing of a criminal activity, but it may weaken the link between the criminal economy and the specific harm being targeted. Finally, it can act as a tool for shaping international debate and catalyzing international coalitions to counter a given criminal activity.
I think to perhaps give a practical example here, because a lot of this is a little bit esoteric, but coming in with kind of a real world example. What we've seen in Libya, for example, is that the designation of human smugglers and traffickers by the United Nations, working with other tools, including those employed by the government of Libya. And I think that this is crucial because oftentimes sanctions work best, not only when they're employed alongside other tools, but when they're employed in conjunction with a host state government. So in Libya, what we saw is that essentially the use of these sanctions and other tools has shifted the ways in which sanctioned and non-sanctioned individuals linked to human smuggling and trafficking engage in illicit economic activity. So what we saw is that criminal actors, human smugglers, human traffickers, took some very clear steps in the wake of those sanctions to lower their profiles, adapt their activities, and in some case, curtailed their involvement altogether in the trade. Furthermore, the sanctions shaped how a number of Libyan armed groups assessed the risks of involvement with illicit economies. And this was particularly important, especially in the context when sanctions were levied out back in 2018. Now, I do want to stress that sanctions were really only one of several tools shaping changes in the social acceptability of certain forms of crime, mainly highly abusive, predatory human smuggling and trafficking, and impacting the social and political standing of those involved in the trade and acting as kind of a broader deterrent in that context. And again, crucially, these trends were emergent before the imposition of the sanctions in 2018. But what the designations did do is further fuel the shifts. And it underscores that if the strategic goal is to shape the criminal ecosystem, sanctions really work best when they're used to support ongoing trends or target vulnerable actors who can be pushed over the edge. I'd also say that it's important to note that whether or not shaping is an intended strategic objective, the issuance of designations often results in a reshaping of the situation. And for those of you that are tuning in, or who have been tuning in across this series of events, if you were there for our discussion on the Central African Republic several weeks ago, that underscored that we've seen a substantial shift in the illicit economy there, in part due to the Kimberley process, which is a very blunt trade-based sanctioning tool. And this really shaped preferences away from diamond extraction by illicit economic actors and militia leaders, but it didn't end their involvement in essentially predation on minerals, predation on extractive industries. Rather, they shifted towards gold. So in that particular case, the imposition of the Kimberley process had a shaping impact, but it was not nearly nuanced enough to actually have the sort of beneficial impacts that were hoped for by many within the international community.
And a key challenge was the fact that this shaping of the criminal ecosystem wasn't particularly anticipated, and so actors were unprepared to deal with these consequences. So moving to the third of our strategic goals, we've called it revelation, so revealing hidden information. So when a sanction is issued on a criminal actor, a brief narrative announcement is also issued that typically lays out the allegations of the specific crimes committed, which underpin the rationale for the regime or cluster of designations. Now, multiple designations can then begin to paint an increasingly detailed and evolving picture of how organized crime or corruption operates and its impact in a given area, particularly because these narratives often underscore impacts partly in an effort to garner greater support for the sanctions themselves. Revelation aims can entail efforts to underscore and promote a counter-narrative that certain criminal actions are out of step with internationally recognized norms. And this is key because that criminal behavior may have become normalized and incur limited reputational damage in a given area. And often in contexts where organized crime is an acute challenge, it is often linked to powerful actors, so we often see a muting of the public discussion. Within the UN system, the panel of experts and the reports that they are mandated to issue perform a critical element of this revelation role. To take one example, the panel of experts for Mali, which did consistent work over a number of years in tracing how the illicit economies were evolving, who the key actors were, and crucially, the high-level connections between those in the artisanal gold trade, the drugs trade, as well as other illicit economies, to political actors and protection structures. And this became more and more important as the space for critique of powerful actors increasingly shut down, particularly since the spate of coups that started in Mali in 2020 and has accelerated since. So the panel really shone a spotlight on activities of criminal actors linked to state actors, which would otherwise have remained very much in the dark. Now, the panel was terminated last year, and it's interesting that it was Russia that vetoed the extension of the regime proposed by other members. But tellingly, it was particularly the panel of experts independent reporting that Russia seemed to have a challenge with. Because actually Russia then proposed extending the regime by a year, but terminating the independent monitoring function. So it seems it was this revelation role that was of particular concern to Russia, given the fact that the panel had repeatedly raised concerns over the operations of the then Wagner Group in the country. And so it was a very targeted attempt to stop the independent monitoring mechanism. Revelation via regimes or sets of linked sanctions can also put pressure on host governments to address actors committing sanctionable offences within their borders. But in many cases, they're even more effective when they can operate to support host governments. So being aimed at assisting governments to tackle the criminality at the root of the sanctions designations, or create entry points for stakeholders to take action, whether within government or civil society. We've seen this play out repeatedly in the Western Balkans, for example, where international sanctions have often been followed by domestic government action, including criminal justice processes.
Okay, so I think these three broad typologies are high-level strategic goals of the regimes. So if we could touch upon how the individual level play out, what is the aim with those designated? Perhaps Matt first.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think on designation objectives, what we assess is that there are really three of these, and these will be familiar to anybody that has kind of traced the development of assessment impacts for sanctioning regimes over the years. These are coercion, which is behavioral change, constraint, and signaling. And if you look at coercion, for example, it's aimed at influencing a designated actor to shift that target's behavior, either in full or in part. Now, this is oftentimes one of the most commonly put forward kind of individual designation objectives. So we want X actor to cease involvement in drug trafficking or to cease involvement in human trafficking. And usually popular expectations of what behavioral change entails are rather maximalist. So it is stopping, ceasing involvement in crime. And this can happen. So for example, if you look at the Cali cartel in Colombia, along with other tools, the use of widespread sanctions on key cartel personnel, as well as essentially businesses owned by them, really targeting throughout the entirety of the structure of that criminal organization, led key cartel figures and their family members to essentially cease involvement in crime. But this is rare, and it's not typically what's expected. Instead, really what you see is that goals oftentimes are much more nuanced, and they're rooted in specific types of harm that lead to designations, as kind of discussed in the strategic goals. And I think if you look at what it is that's driving designees to do this, especially on the criminal front, it's essentially the desire to unlock frozen funds, to get access back to their money or to the banking system. It's important to note, this is very obvious, but it's important to note that criminals, generally speaking, do things about money. There's not a broader ideology involved. There's not some sort of deprivation that they're willing to go through to ultimately get to some sort of political goal. They're interested in recouping benefits from their efforts and in enjoying those benefits. And if you take away the enjoyment of those benefits, that's a powerful tool against them that, for example, does not readily exist when you're looking at terrorist groups or when you're looking at specific countries, which oftentimes are willing to go through deprivation.
And I think one point to underscore that is the importance of delisting as an incentive for behavioral change. And there are examples of delisting due to behavioral change, but the numbers do remain quite low compared to the numbers of actors and entities sanctioned. For example, in the United States, according to the Treasury Department's 2021 sanctions review, over the last 20 years, we've seen roughly 12,000 listings. And this contrasts to nearly 3,000 delistings. This seems like a relatively material proportion, but bear in mind that delistings occur for a number of reasons, including deaths and procedural errors. So a smaller proportion of these were due to behavioral change. And unfortunately, we continue to see across designating jurisdictions that the processes for delisting remain pretty opaque in most cases. Delistings are quite rare, and we feel that this is an important point to improve upon to have a clearer incentive for the behavioral change that sanctions regimes are seeking to drive.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd completely agree with that. And, I'd refer those that are interested in this particular element of delistings to look at the Convergence Zone report. This is the first of the webinars that we did, but we have an extensive section in there on the delisting approaches and the gaps in those approaches by the US, by the UN, EU, UK, and a very robust set of recommendations around it. Now, on the second of the designation objectives, this is constraint. Now, basically, constraint is that targeted sanctions are meant to impose a cost on criminal actors that either constrains their ability to operate or makes operating undesirable by tipping the cost-benefit analysis. And in doing so, minimizes the threat they pose to the sanctioning jurisdiction's interests. You can think of this as increasing friction on criminal economies. And constraint really is significantly linked to financial sanctions. The impact is enabled in part by the centrality of the EU, UK, and particularly US financial systems to the global financial architecture. These are three of the most active sanctioning jurisdictions and the most active cogs in the wheel of global finance. And so they have a particular power there to impact and increase that friction when it comes to criminal actors. Now, the line between illicit economies and the illicit sector is often quite blurry, and organized crime groups often rely on formal financial systems and illicit business at one point in time or another to operate. So, for example, if you look at human smuggling and human trafficking coming from the Horn of West Africa or the Horn of Africa to Europe, what you see is that while the migrants that are moving may be moving in a relatively linear geographic fashion. So up from Somalia, through Ethiopia, into Sudan, into Libya, and then over the Mediterranean, the way that their money moves oftentimes is nonlinear, and it shifts into jurisdictions that can be quite far afield before ultimately it's routed back to the hands of the smugglers, or in some cases, the predatory actors that take these individuals hostage. Now, financial sanctions can achieve an effect in part by incentivizing illicit economic enterprises to decouple themselves from sanctioned criminal actors. Where host states support sanctions, you can really see a magnification of this impact, especially, for example, in Colombia, which has enabled domestic banks to terminate the accounts of individuals and entities sanctioned under the US Kingpin Act. And this has had a real and particular impact on essentially the constraint function of sanctions there. Now, even if states don't support sanctions, this makes continued engagement with sanctioned actors a decision which carries cost. So if you look at Guinea-Bissau, back in 2014, the removal of Antonio Indaji, the head of the military, was largely due to pressure from the international community in the wake of his sanctioning for his role in the 2012 coup, which was in turn most likely driven by interest in the cocaine trade. And often what we see is that constraining can be most effective where designations go beyond the leadership of a criminal organization and start to target, like I said, at the Cali cartel, mid-level actors or those involved in money laundering. Their cost-benefit analysis may be much easier to shift than the higher-level kingpins, but with significant implications for the overall functioning of networks and markets. I'd say finally, there's signaling. And this is the use of a designation to convey a message to a broader audience or to different messages to different audiences that signal to broader criminal ecosystems, basically a message to broader criminal ecosystems that the individual or the company operates in. Now, signaling via designations has often been used as a means of making a political statement to domestic audiences, a diplomatic statement to international audiences, or reinforcing international norms, such as around non-proliferation or human rights. But in the context of organized crime, it's a little bit different. I think you can also see it as influencing the criminal ecosystem, aiding government officials in addressing criminality and affirming for societies and victims that certain crimes have occurred. Signal can often have a deterrent impact aimed at coercing other criminals into avoiding certain behaviors lest they be sanctioned. And this can be particularly helpful in contexts of impunity. It can be particularly impactful as a deterrent for individuals sitting at the nexus of criminality and government power, including military and security officials, political officials, and business people. And these individuals may not be at the heart of a criminal organization, but they often play a crucial supportive and facilitating role. I'd say with signaling, this often doesn't lead to a stop in criminal activity per se, but it has repeatedly changed the ways of operating. And crucially, going back to the strategic element, changed the way that certain criminal actors engage in their activities to minimize and mitigate the risk of specific designated harms. Finally, and to echo what Lucia said, we see signaling having an impact in terms of catalyzing government action against designees or building popular support for it. This is particularly the case in the Western Balkans, but if you look at cases worldwide, this is not an uncommon outcome of sanctions, starting to build pressure for domestic law enforcement and prosecutorial approaches to essentially gather steam, even at individuals that have substantial higher level political protection.
So where do you feel strategic thinking on sanctions and transnational organized crime needs to go from here? What are some areas where there is still pronounced or problematic gaps? Perhaps Lucia first.
A priority is definitely increasing clarity and strategic focus in deploying sanctions as a tool to responding to transnational organized crime, both internally within the sanctioning body and regarding how the sanctions are communicated. So within sanctioning bodies, it's absolutely critical that there's a clear strategy and that it's been thought out how sanctions regimes or clusters of designations drive towards that and what the clear indicators of the success can be. In our conversations with policymakers, many were quite candid in sharing that they felt that there was a limited overarching strategy in how sanctions were being deployed to respond to transnational organized crime. And this can really undermine impact, but also it opens up sanctioning to the critique of approaches being haphazard or arbitrary or merely based on a political whim, which not only undermines their impact, but can also undermine the perceived legitimacy of sanctions. And these regimes need to not only be thought out and designed strategically from within the sanctioning body, but communicated clearly and strategically. So we need a rowing away from very expansionist rhetoric that sets really unrealistic goals for sanctions regimes, and we need a much more careful communication of clear objectives.
Yeah, so I mean, I think to perhaps add to that, there's a need to focus effort, and that's certainly what the examples that fed into the development of this framework underscore. And I mean, this is the entire point of the strategic level of groups of designations. So, put simply, sanctions are more likely to have impact where there's a focused effort on targeting multiple individuals in one area. So, some jurisdictions, such as the United States, do this with frequency. But exhaustive approaches to designating multiple linked members of a given network, and in some cases affiliated entities, is broadly at the global level the exception to the rule. Generally, what you see is only a limited number of designations are meted out. And if you look at UN designations, for example, this is very common on key leaders. And the problem there is, and the missed opportunity, is that those key leaders are oftentimes the most insulated and resilient members of a criminal network. They can take the challenge that is being meted out by sanctions, and largely figure out workarounds. And they have the financial wherewithal and, crucially, the organizational wherewithal to do that. Whereas lower level members that are less prominent within the organization that nonetheless play key or irreplaceable roles, especially in finances, in logistics, or as the connective tissue to other criminal networks. Because remember, if you look at especially drug traffickers, human traffickers, those that are moving products, they're best thought of essentially as logistical webs. And so they need that relational capital and the people holding that relational capital to be able to actually operate. And so what you see is that throwing the net wide significantly enhances the likely impact of sanctions. Like I said, encompassing those at the margins for whom the cost of being sanctioned is far higher than for those at the core. I guess the other thing I'd come back to, and again, this is building on what Lucia had framed before, is investing in delisting. This is crucial. The boom in building sanctions capacity over the last 20 years is mainly focused on issuing designations rather than capacity for delisting of previously designated actors. But what we see is that delisting and the potential for delisting is a key inducement for behavioral change. And if you have systemic behavioral change by a number of linked actors, that can lead to strategic change. And that's where it starts to become potentially important and a tool to be used in tandem with the wider net that I was just discussing. So what we think is that for jurisdictions interested in using sanctions as a tool to counter organized crime, there really needs to be an equivalent investment and strategic think through of delisting approaches and delisting capacity. And then finally, linking in with Lucia's point on strategy, I think there needs to be a greater anticipation of shaping. So decisions to establish a regime or issue a cluster of designations should be underpinned by a strategic assessment of how sanctions are likely to change, to impact the illicit markets and the ecosystem. Ideally, there should be foresight exercises that are done, essentially dynamic tabletops that seek to really get out in front of how these organizations are likely to adapt and put in place the tools and approaches that are essential there. I guess the final thing that I'd point out here on what also needs to be done is that there needs to be a crucially more robust think through of how it is that other tools can be used alongside of sanctions, not just by the states employing sanctions, though that's part of it. And for those of you that attended our webinar on Haiti, this is a lot of what we talked about, the use of multiple tools by a single state. But we also think that there's a strong possibility of using different tools by different states. Some use sanctions, some use prosecutorial approaches, some use aid, some use diplomatic support, all linked together within a broader strategic effort against what, at the end of the day, are ultimately transnational problems that have an impact on a variety of different jurisdictions. And by working together strategically and bringing different tools to the table, the potential to systemically impact organized crime along the entirety of a route or the entirety of an ecosystem and limit the harms that it poses to the various jurisdictions along the way become much more enhanced.
Thanks, both of you. I know there are already some questions coming up in the chat, but I do have one more question to you. How would you recommend that this framework to be used, and how do you think it contribute to efforts to further develop sanctions as a tool for countering transnational organized crime?
So in many ways, the assessments of impact that we've used as examples and that we go into further depth in the report itself are some of the clearest, most well-known cases. But how sanctions actually impact illicit economies is in many cases far less clear. And evidence for impact is difficult to obtain, establishing causality remains quite complex, but it's imperative that sanctioning entities' analyses begin from a clear assessment of strategic goals for each regime or linked series of designations. From there, assessments can use the GI framework to detail how designation objectives have impacted individuals, the criminal ecosystem, and broader societies. And we hope that through such comprehensive approaches, a clearer picture of the impact of sanctions on organized crime threats can be developed and more effective sanctioning approaches crafted. And part of the goal of our work, of this report, of the work stream more broadly, is to drive greater depth into the debate of do sanctions work, recognizing that they are increasingly utilized as a tool for responding to transnational organized crime, often in contexts where alternatives are perceived to be quite scarce, and really exploring how sanctions regimes can be designed and implemented to work better. And we feel that a granular breakdown of purpose and a more detailed understanding of impact, which we hope that this framework is one step towards, is a step forwards here.
Yeah, I'd agree with all that. I'd also add in perhaps the internal and external strategic element here. So in many ways, what this framework offers is both an assessment and a strategic option. And if you look internally into the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, what we want to do within the global initiative is keep testing this as a framework for considering sanctions regimes, their impacts, including in our engagements with policymakers and in supporting the design of sanctions regimes, or supporting those that are designing sanctions regimes. Secondly, within the broader analyst community, our hope is that other analysts can also leverage and test this framework. We think that this is essentially a first development of a tool that looks at an issue that is likely to be used in greater frequency going forward. And so we're cognizant that it likely is going to need refining. There are going to be elements that haven't been encapsulated within this initial framework that will ultimately become important. And what we hope to do is to kickstart a conversation and kickstart substantial global analytic thinking on a lot of these issues around organized crime, sanctions, impact, and strategy. So we hope to be further tweaking this and further building this out going forward. Finally, on policymakers, what we hope is that this strategic framework can support both in the design of strategy around regimes and objectives, and also in terms of how they're communicated. Because we think the communication issue is quite key, and this is oftentimes where we see the greatest divergence between what sanctions professionals think and are saying, and what policymakers are publicly communicating to their national audiences in particular. And again, while it's understandable that there is a desire by politicians to adopt oftentimes maximalist language, ultimately it's counterproductive in that it sets expectations by publics and also by policymakers themselves extraordinarily high, and maybe out of reach for what sanctions can actually accomplish and other tools can actually accomplish. So I think that those are some of the key things that we're thinking about now. But clearly, there will be others that evolve as we go forward. And I should say that the focus research initiative being done by the Global Initiative here, not only will we have further webinars coming up over the next couple of weeks, including on Guinea-Bissau, as well as on the use of the Global Initiative's Global Organized Crime Index to assist in the strategy and assessment of sanctions. But we also have a number of written reports and research processes that are underway that will be seeking to dive down and look both at particular thematics, such as human smuggling and human trafficking and sanctions, particular regions such as the Balkans or some areas of North and West Africa, or to look at a global picture, such as how sanctioning for effect can really take place at a practical level by jurisdictions that are involved.
Thanks a lot. And thanks for this comprehensive overview on the framework and the report. And I encourage all participants to have a look at the website and download all these materials that were mentioned by both Lucia and Matt. We do have a couple of questions in the chat. I'll take them in turns, so perhaps two each time. The first two questions, one is related to how international organizations are recognizing the links between criminal groups and states. If this is being recognized or entirely new, how is it growing? And how valid is terms like organized crime now? Does it need to be subdivided into different types, requiring different approaches? So perhaps Matt first and then Lucia.
Sure. So, I mean, I think on some of the questions that we see in terms of the links between criminal groups and states using them as proxies, this is obviously an issue that is out there, and I think that it's an important issue to look at. But it's not a particular focus within our sanctions workstream. I would direct the individual posing the question to look at the broader corpus of Global Initiative work on the issue, because we have done quite a lot on it. But on the second question, how valid is the term organized crime now? I think it is quite valid at top level. Transnational organized crime is an important referential tool. But I think in terms of the development of further sanctions regimes, such as at the level of the United Nations, or even within particular jurisdictions such as the European Union, it likely is much more valuable to subdivide down to specific typologies. And this is largely for political reasons. So within the United States and the United Kingdom, for example, it is feasible to use organized crime as essentially a catch-all element. But the sort of negotiated push-pull that you see dominating within the European Union restrictive measures approaches, the way they refer to sanctions, and certainly within the UN Security Council when it comes to sanctions, means that there oftentimes is quite a bit of controversy and quite a bit of difference between different member states over the term organized crime. And so focusing a regime on something such as human smuggling and human trafficking can be much more specific and much more useful in laying out objectives and gaining concurrence by member states and others to address it.
And jumping in there on the definitional point, in practice, as Matt noted, we do see regimes taking kind of modulated approaches to different forms of organized crime. Now, in our work in developing this framework, we intentionally kept it focused on organized crime as a whole, because we believe that it can be used as a framework for analyzing different types of sanctions regimes, focusing on different forms of organized crime, rather than, of course, it can be tailored down further, and that may well be helpful when applying to a particular case study. But we felt it was important to have a degree of comparability in the frameworks that we're using for tracing purpose and impact across the use of sanctions as a tool against organized crime more generally. On the point of state and non-state actors, of course, we use these two words, and that seems to suggest this clearly defined binary. And of course, it's much more blurred than that. And the role of state actors in organized crime is extremely significant. The ENACT and Global Initiative Organized Crime Index repeatedly underscores state actors as amongst the most important types of criminal actors in different regions of the world. And we do see a number of sanctioning approaches that go on both sides of this line and that seem to try and sever that link between politics and crime. And an upcoming report that we have considering the context in the Western Balkans is quite centrally focused on the role of sanctions in breaking this nexus between politics and crime.
Thanks. If we can look at two questions more, and I know I want to be mindful of the time as well. There's a question on Libya. Matt, I think it relates to the example that you gave throughout the webinar today. If you could address that, how and when could the framework put in place in Libya, and how can the state of Libya be part of the actual implementation of a response plan? And if there is research that covers weaponization of pre-investigation, pre-trial listing, and sanctions, if you could both address those questions, please.
Yeah, I think the question on drug trafficking in Libya gets to an important point. So, I think we should start by laying out the field clearly, and that's that drug trafficking through Libya is not Libya's problem alone. It doesn't start and it doesn't stop with Libya. Rather, Libya is sitting in a particular place where drugs coming in from other countries are moved through there and then on to other points. So this is part of a much more complicated logistical chain that in many cases, though it depends on the narcotic involved, involves countries in Africa, in Europe, in South America, and in some cases within the Middle East. And so this is a problem for a number of different jurisdictions. And this is potentially an opportunity for Libya to lead on this. What we would argue is that developing a targeted strategy to address drug trafficking through Libya would start with states coming together to strategically size the issue, to identify where the key challenges are and what the key harms they're looking to mitigate are. And then looking crucially at what tools can be brought to the table by different jurisdictions. So it might be that Libya can lead in particular on the prosecution of individuals that are involved in drug trafficking within its own borders, while sanctions in turn are levied on those by other jurisdictions, by the European Union, or not the European Union because they don't actually do drug sanctions, but say by the United States, to address some of the transnational challenges, those actors that move between jurisdictions that are particularly difficult for individual state authorities to really address. And then also looking to other states that are out there, such as the European Union or to the United Kingdom, to support either on investigative efforts or on aid to various countries along this pathway. But crucially, the thing here is that the efforts need to be strategically designed. And I think that that's what's been done particularly poorly to date. And they need to be strategically designed with the countries that are affected deeply involved in that design. So oftentimes you hear of a critique by countries whose nationals are designated saying, this is not good for us. This is a problem for us. We weren't consulted on this. Now, transnational organized crime really is everybody's problem. And so it is an opportunity for these states to become part of the discussion and part of the strategic framing of how it is that sanctions can actually play into the sort of solutions that they need to achieve, and how it is that other strategic tools can do that too. So I would say that specifically on drugs, on cocaine, on cannabis resin, on synthetics, these flows, which are increasingly a problem for Libya, not just in terms of trafficking through, but also consumption by youth in the country. this is an opportunity to really build out their strategic leadership in this particular fora and bring others in. Now, to draw together two of the questions on proportionality and on weaponization of kind of pre-investigation and pre-trial listing and sanction, I think it's important here to really underscore what sanctions are not. And we did this in the first webinar, but it's useful to do it here too. They're not legal tools. These are administrative tools by states. They're not meant to supplant judicial systems. They may draw on the same evidence that ultimately goes towards prosecutions, but they're not prosecutions. It's not an adjudication of definitive criminal guilt or liability. And so in terms of proportionality, that has a substantial implication because, if you're looking at these largely as diplomatic tools that are meant to shape a criminal challenge, then the issue of proportionality is important, yes, but at the same time, it becomes less of the definitive point to be focused upon. But simply, if an individual is involved in organized crime and is playing a key role, even if only 10% of their income is coming from organized crime, that's not a sufficient way to evade liability for that 10%. And so sanctions can be a tool for addressing them. And I would say that the proportionality issue here, and this is where we get into delisting, can be addressed by them simply changing their behavior. But that requires that there be substantial investment in delisting capacity that allows for information to be received and rapid action upon receipt of that information. So this gets into the delisting element. On the issue of weaponization of pre-investigation and pre-trial listing and sanction, I think that this is where it gets into an area where it's very useful to bring in the states that are involved. And so to bring in the states that are most directly affected by this criminal activity, because the question of weaponization is really a political one. What is being weaponized and by who? And so I think if you look at the sanctioning jurisdictions, what they would argue is that this is not weaponization, pre-investigation and pre-trial. This is meant to do something a little bit different. Now, what you also sometimes see is that there can be delisting of an individual if they've been held criminally culpable by an investigation and trial in their home country. And so this is also another avenue or to be delisted. And so these two elements can functionally work in tandem. But yeah, again, fundamentally, the question of weaponization is really a bit where you stand depends on where you sit.
And to touch upon one point in the question regarding Libya, there's a critique essentially of the flaws in the data picture that are involved by the panel and by reports linked to sanctions. But I think it's important to underscore that in the context of the revelation strategic goal, this is often in context where there's a real lack of data, and that this data is often very difficult to get, or even if it exists, it's usually issued by mouthpieces with less power, less wide reach, and that are seen as less objectives as institutions like panels of experts. So even if they are imperfect, even if they're not comprehensive, and they won't be because there are always resource restrictions, they can nonetheless be a big step forward, and to have these repeated objective assessments can be extremely powerful. And we've seen the impacts of sanctions significantly undermined in contexts where this revelation element has not been leveraged as much as it could be. So for example, in the context of the sanctions regime on Guinea-Bissau, which we'll be exploring a little bit more in the next webinar in this series, a panel of experts was never established. And this really limited the depth and breadth of the information that was issued around the sanctions regime and process, and is perceived by many stakeholders to be one flaw that really undermined the impact that the regime could have had.
Well, it seems like we are approaching the end of the webinar. I really thank Lucia and Matt for sharing all this information today, guiding us through the framework. And I invite you all to check on the report in the Global Initiative's website and join us in 2 weeks' time on the 4th of July at 3 p.m. Central European time to discuss the application of this framework in the case of Guinea-Bissau, and as a way of how the sanctions, and explore the role of sanctions regime as part of responses to crime and instability in the country. So a very interesting conversation ahead of us as well. I would like to thank Matt and Lucia once more, the participants, for posing all these questions and enriching the discussion today. Please reach out to us if you have any further questions. I'm sure the team will be glad to respond. I wish you a very nice day ahead of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.